Hello, welcome to our presentation on research ethics and data protection and social media research in the Meet the Experts series at GESIS. I'm Oliver Watteler, and together with my colleague Katrin Weller, as Maria has just told you, we are going to talk about the two topics. I'm going to start off by introducing research or data protection to you first. So just a few words on what is research ethics. So research ethics is a very broad topic, and it mostly covers moral principles and actions guiding and shaping your research. They have to be considered in most research projects, especially in those on human subjects, and they have to be considered from the very beginning on, from the inception on until completion, because a lot of research projects, or most of them today, do collect data and have to consider the fact that the data is safeguarded and published for other purposes afterwards. And research ethics in the social sciences was initially patient protection, or followed the patient protection model of medical research, so very tight with written consent forms and so on. And then social media research, this has all been put to question because a lot of data is collected from online platforms without the knowledge of the participants or the data subjects. So today is a very much broader scope and includes considerations of benefits, risk, and harm to all individuals involved, not only the research participants, but the researchers as well. And closely connected, though a different topic, is data protection. And in a simple term, you can say that data protection is part of your fundamental right to privacy. So it doesn't only cover the data world, but also the, let's say, offline world. And in technical terms, it's also your right to informational freedom. So you can decide who you want to share your data with or not. And in the word of Needling, privacy in general is a personal condition of life characterized by seclusion from and therefore absence of acquaintance by the public. So this is closely related, but you all probably know the challenges of our online digital world because it's full of our data traces. So this seclusion, the closing the door of your home is probably not feasible any longer. And data protection is basically the prevention of unwanted disclosure of personal information and the probable or possible misuse of this. And there is a whole legal framework, not only in the European Union, but we'll cover the European Union and in special the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. But most countries worldwide do have a National Data Protection Act or Data Protection Law, and there are specialized law depending on the areas you're dealing with in your research. For example, if you're dealing with school children, so adolescents, minors, that we have to ask for consent from parents and so on. We're going to scratch the surface in this presentation of what data protection means in its entirety, but it's worthwhile to look at the principles as laid out in Article 5 of the GDPR, because they also show the links to ethics, research ethics here. For example, if you look at the first block, data processing should be lawful, fair, and transparent. And that means, first of all, you have to have a legal basis for your data processing. So if you collect data online, or most social science projects, the processing is based on informed consent. If you collect data online without consent, you either have to try to get the consent afterwards, or you have to look for technical and organizational ways to protect the people behind the data before you do your research. Fair means that people whose data is being processed have to rely on the facts or the information they are being presented with beforehand. So it means that if I tell them, oh, this is market research, I'm collecting your data for, and afterwards it's becoming a marketing tool because I'm sending you more information or even products, then I'm probably misusing your data. It's an unfair use of your data. And transparency is one of the utmost important of principles of utmost importance, because you have to be able to trace who's dealing with which data and for what purpose. In the online world, this is often not possible, and we are consenting to a lot of usages of our data, and it's probably a pretty intransparent way. But there are a lot of court cases by now that show that if you run into a trap, you might want to go after the people who misuse your data. And the basic point here is that there should be no surprises and no covered activities, yeah, concerning data processing. Purpose limitation, the second block, is you have to have a certain purpose that you collect the data for. Science, research, or scientific research, however you want to coin it, is a valid purpose in the sense of GDPR. So you are entitled to collect personal data for your research purposes. And as it's spelled out in the GDPR itself, data may only be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes, and not further processed in a manner that is incompatible with those purposes. But there is an exemption for research. That means if the data was collected for other purposes, for example, social security data or data by an insurance company or others, it might be reused for scientific purposes under certain circumstances. So you are in a way in a privileged situation. Doesn't allow you to do everything, but there are some loopholes here to advance or help advance research. Then data minimization refers to the fact that you should only collect the data that you really need. If you think of tweets, a tweet in the background is not only, as most of you probably know, the tweet ID, an alias name, a picture on the Twitter website, and the tweet consent itself, but there are like some 50 plus metadata tags attached to it. If you allow for it, the geo-reference, the location you sent the tweet from, which directly refers to cities, counties, regions. So your tweet is not just a text blob. It becomes very well attached to the person who sent the message. And if you don't need those metadata information, if you're not interested in the geolocation, you shouldn't collect it. That's the point behind data minimization. Then data accuracy is more for, let's say, administrative data. So if your bank, your insurance company, the government holds data on you, this data should be accurate. Think of credits you're asking for, and all of a sudden there's false information on you someplace, and you don't receive that credit you are asking for your private home because of inaccurate information. That might bring you into trouble. So accuracy, the data should always be kept correct. Yeah. And concerning research participants do always have the right, as long as their data can be attached to them. If there's a personal identifier still available, they do have the right for corrections and even deletion until this personal information has been taken away from the research data. So even after your project has been finished, and there's this research participant that wants to bail out, he or she has the right to do so. Then there's storage limitations. So if you don't need data anymore, you should delete it. Of course, this collides with the open science principle that the data should be reused, it should be put into a repository for other people to use. But then think of classical surveys where you have an address and you send out a survey form, or you do an online survey. If you don't need the contact information anymore, the email address you sent the form to, the address, the phone number, delete that part, yeah? And then you can still store the other, the actual research data. And again, for research, there's a loophole here. There's an exemption because researchers are allowed to store personal data longer than the regular users can. Then the next block is integrity and confidentiality. And I just read it out. It means that you should protect the data against unauthorized or unlawful processing and against accidental loss, destruction, or damage. And this, of course, means the data shouldn't be lying around on network drives, on your cloud service, unencrypted, open for your entire research project. Keep an eye on that, because as it says in Article 5, Section 2, you are accountable. As a researcher, you become what is called a controller, and you are in charge, and you can be held liable. And as you can read in the GDPR, fees can be quite high. There have been not many cases of fraudulent use of data in research so far, but the appropriate authorities can fine you, or they can even quote you, or they can sue you and drag you to court if you're misusing the data. So I've already mentioned that there's a close link between data protection and research ethics. And if we are to name one thing that marks this link, it's informed consent. And that means that the research individuals should be informed. It should be transparent to them what the data has been used for. And the minimal requirement of informed consent, there's a whole range of information you have to put into your consent form and so on. But the minimal requirement is to give research participants the chance to say no, not to consent. And of course, if you collect data from online, from social media platforms, without asking anybody, or even cheating your way into a platform, dragging out some data, I, as a user of any social media platform, do not have any say in any usage of my data. So in regular, as we pointed out here, there's a lack of consent in social media research, but this is changing. Actors and dependencies. So we've marked 5 areas here in this ethical framework, and this is just giving you an overview. We'll get back to this is kind of like our index. And the first thing we're going to look at is the borderless internet and national legislation here, because as I've pointed out, there's the GDPR, there's national law, but then there are also ethical review committees. They are named differently in different countries and different areas, but basically a group of researchers reviewing your research proposal. There are publisher requirements. More and more journals ask you to store data on their platform, on their journal websites. Then there are ethical guidelines by the discipline you're working in. And if you're working with social media platforms, there are the terms of services of those platforms. And users of those platforms have entered into valid agreements and to contracts with these social media platforms, and they have to rely on the fact if this platform doesn't allow for any other use than just within the platform, that means that your research might be illegal. So you have to watch out what the terms of service say, because as in the moment you pass a login, you are inside the platform, and then the terms of services hold. So just a quick overview of data protection legislation. What is the GDPR? If you're into legal text, you might want to go over these 99 articles. They apply directly in the European Union. Great Britain will now be the first former member of the EU that is redoing its legislation on data protection. But it directly applies in the Netherlands, in Poland, in Germany. It was an intention to harmonize data protection law EU-wide, but then there are about 150 so-called opening clauses or exemptions where national legislators can come up with their own ideas. So in the end, we're not looking at one harmonized act of data protection. And that means if you're in an international research cooperation, you might have to look at the national variations of data protection law. And yes, we look at the national laws, we have special laws, as I've mentioned in the beginning. And at least in the German case, but that also holds true for European laws, there's a conflict, and that's also referring to the ethical side. There's your freedom of research, but there's also the freedom of personal information or privacy. So there are two fundamental rights that collide that have to be brought into some kind of consensus here. And this is what the informed consent is all about. And as a matter of fact, the problem about GDPR, and this is what all the complaints aim at, is it's a catch-all regulation aiming at major companies dealing with loads of data, not probably at your small research project, but you also fall under the GDPR as long as you're within the EU. So what is personal data? And again, we're not looking at all the details here because it's a quite lengthy definition, very broad definition. But as you can see, it's a relative definition here because it says that personal data means any information related to an identified or identifiable natural person. That means that the data doesn't needs to be a name and an address, but it can also be an alias that pops up, or an identifier. And here you've got a whole list of things that might link back to a natural person, like an identification number, your social security number, for example, used in many Scandinavian countries for election research. And then a lot of things, especially medical information, genetic information, physiological information, information on your mental health, and so on. And are we actually talking about personal data when it comes to social media? Examples of personal data, as mentioned before, of course, might look familiar to you because there are loads of images online. And we've all heard, or most of you probably heard about the case of Clearview AI scraping millions of pictures from Google and then using it to re-identify individuals and also selling off this information to law enforcement agencies. So all of a sudden, your innocent picture might become part of an investigation. Information on physical and mental health is especially protected under the GDPR, not only under the GDPR, under many other laws as well. Geolocations, I've mentioned the tweet. If you don't turn it off, there's a georeference. And according to a ruling by the European Court of Justice in 2016, a fixed IP address is also a personal information. The problem about all this, and you're well aware of this, is the ubiquity and linkability of all this data. It's digital, it's online, and it can be used for profiling. I can draw on information from different sources, put it together, and all of a sudden I get a profile of a person. And the entirety of this data might be very revealing. So the answer, are we talking about personal data, is most likely yes. And now I hand over to my colleague, Katrin. Stop my presentation now, and the floor is yours, Katrin.
So we've seen this ecosystem of different actors that play a role in ethical considerations and that kind of influence the different challenges that are there and that consider ethical questions in social media research. We now turn over to the probably most important actors in this overall framework, and that is the social media users that are the ones whose data is in question here. So a key problem of social media research and also the question of consent and the question of are users aware of what's being done with their data in these kind of research is that we actually have very conflicting interests here. Typically, social media research is especially interested in observing social media users in their natural habitat in ways that are not influenced by any research design, by any researcher interacting with the users. Most of the study designs are relying on unobtrusive data, on using data as it appears. And that, of course, has a core conflict when it comes to obtaining informed consent, because at the moment where you obtain consent before a study, you are interfering with this setup, and you do not simply observe social media users in their normal interactions. So we're entering a huge area of challenges here, and as I would like to point out in the beginning, I do not have the exact answer on how to solve that here, and probably no one has yet, because this is all an area that is still evolving, where a lot of discussions are being going on at the moment on how to handle that, on how to handle these cases. There are first examples of also explicitly obtaining consent for certain subpopulations of a social media platform, but in many cases it's actually not only undesirable but technically close to impossible. If you look into social media studies that look at millions and huge numbers of user accounts, where it's simply unfeasible to obtain any form of explicit consent. What has recently started, and what is maybe a first step towards getting solutions in that area, is lines of research that actually look into how the users of social media platforms are aware of their data potentially ending up in a research paper as the basis of some ongoing research. And I'm showing you the example of Casey Feisler and Nicholas Proferis here, who did a study of Twitter users and their awareness of the potential that their tweets are being used in scientific research or in other sort of research. And what they show is that different potential usage scenarios would impact the way in which they feel about this, from very uncomfortable to comfortable, and that has a lot of, they reveal some dimensions that kind of make the situation less uncomfortable, at least. In the Twitter case, people, of course, have signed up for the terms of service at some point, which also includes somewhere the notion that data might be shared with external entities, but let's assume that no one is reading that closely. So we have these lines of research starting, but another ongoing discussion is of distinguishing different types of users on social media platforms. So when it comes to an ethical judging of how careful, how cautious you have to be with dealing with specific research designs, there's a clear, we're going towards an agreement in the research community that we clearly have to distinguish different types of accounts. For example, celebrities, professional accounts, for example, also party accounts, public figures of any sort, can certainly be assumed that they are aware that people are seeing their tweets, reading their tweets, having access to them, which I think still is not the case for any regular Twitter user. Some might not even be aware that everyone can follow them on Twitter, that their tweets are publicly visible beyond their followers, and these kind of things. Then we have different sorts of groups who, even beyond what is set down in the legal regulations, should be taken very cautiously also on an ethical reflection level. And that, for example, includes activists. So there have been cases of research studies which actually actively look into cases like the Arab Spring movement or the Occupy Wall Street protests, which of course include lots of activists for political aims, which not only constitutes sensitive data in the sense that they're revealing political opinions, but that also, depending on the specific setting of the political situation in a country, for example, might be under serious risk of harming their health, their life, risking their life when they participate in this. And research that looks into these kind of areas and contains information that might help to reveal activists' personal information, of course, pose a very different threat also beyond maybe theoretic considerations. Other effects that need to be encountered are that marginalized groups often also are underrepresented in social media data in some form, and that by conducting research, we might actually even contribute to marginalization, also to polarization of certain kinds of groups by conducting work that proposes certain findings. For example, when not considering well enough the demographics below the data set, drawing incorrect conclusions that might lead to ongoing harm and continuous problems for these groups afterwards. As we've just heard, there are also actually specific regulations in place for example, people underage and minors, where we would actually need consent from their parents. Oftentimes, we cannot be sure whether there would be any of these groups in our data set at all. So, of course, there might be terms of services which say that you cannot use a certain platform under the age of X, but we do not have any sort of control if people might just ignore this, and whether we might end up with having, for example, minors or other vulnerable groups in our data set. Just another pointer to some of the ongoing work in this area, and this is, as already also was pointed out, there might be very sensitive information in the area of health and medical situations, and we have seen recently some work in that area that looks more closely into potential solutions for obtaining consent and informed consent in these kind of communities. So, for example, when working with specific platforms on where patients exchange their experiences. Another highly ethically challenging area is everything that looks, for example, into prevention of suicides, and this includes research that actually aims to provide preventive measures for people at the risk of suicide, but it leads to ethical implications on a level of how far also technology is supposed to interfere in this sense, and what side effects might arise when concluding, for example, from some algorithmic judgment that some person is at risk of suicide, and thus reacting to that on a platform. Which also kind of leads us to the platform level of this entire consideration. So as I've said before, typically there are terms of conditions that you sign up for when you enter a platform. But the key challenge here from a research perspective is that not all platforms are equal, that the terms of services may differ very much from the platform side. Also, the ways in which you can actually collect the data may vary significantly. And on the user side, the actual options for how to protect what can be seen by others publicly or not might differ quite a bit. So if you consider Twitter versus Facebook, for example, Twitter is relatively simple. It just distinguishes between having a public profile or a protected account. You do not have to enter your real name, but it gives quite some comprehensive access to researchers via the APIs, so the data is easily accessible. Compared to that, Facebook has a very complex system of privacy settings. You may even change settings for each individual post that you leave on Facebook, which means on the user side that users might lose track of what they have actually set their profile to. They might have less understanding of how publicly visible their activities might be. Then another challenge with Facebook is that here real names actually are requested by the platform. Not everyone adheres to this, but that's the setting. On the other hand side, there are very limited options for researchers to actually access data from Facebook. And this is changing constantly. So we are in a situation where getting an overview and trying to come to an ethical judgment of what users could have reasonably expected that is happening on the platform are really difficult, also due to the ephemerality of the data. Yeah, and finally, there are actors who are somehow placed in this framework, who have a specific interest in finding solutions for all these ethical challenges, who are already working on some of the solutions. But as research with social media data is quite a diverse, involving diverse sets of disciplines, for example, diverse sets of research approaches from qualitative studies to the big data side, which still has lots of challenges on the method sides in itself, so lack of standards for how to conduct specific kind of research. And that also includes the research ethic parts. And there is some work going on, and we will attach to the final slide deck that we're going to share on the website. We will have some pointers to related literature that you might want to take a look at in the future. But let's conclude for now that this entire changing nature of both social media platforms, how users make use of it, and the broader complexities of also legal situations makes it difficult to develop exact standards and exact recommendations. Which is why, instead of telling you this is exactly how you should do it, and that's the same approach that you will find in the documents that are available, like the ethics guidelines from the Association of Internet Researchers, they will also not tell you exactly, in this case, do that, but they would rather encourage you to think about specific questions that might reoccur and that might come along the way. And we've also collected a set of guiding questions and some illustrative examples that should help you to get thinking more about the potential ethical implications that a research design might bring along. And our key message here is that this is something you should do from the very beginning of your study and continue throughout. So it should, you should reserve capacities, time, maybe additional personal resources to think about these things throughout the research project. And maybe revisit some decisions you have made at later stages also. So this is a set of initial guiding questions for research that also connect back to the first part of this talk, which includes asking yourself at the beginning, will you actually collect personal data with your data collection approach? And as we told you in the beginning, very likely the answer will be yes. The challenge to figure out the actual legal basis for how the data is collected and processed. And in your project team, figure out who's responsible for the different steps in handling the data, who has access to the actual data now or maybe in the future. Consider if you are looking into special category data, so the very sensitive types of data like health information. Think about the option of informed consent. I already assume that in most of the scenarios that you might be working on, it is close to impossible to actually obtain informed consent, but there are some exceptions for that. Yeah, that includes the question, did you make any, did you try at all to get in touch with the research participants? Finally, a core question also is about anonymization. Is it possible to anonymize the data, which in the case of social media data also often is very hard, especially if quoted posts, quoted text from users can kind of be reverse engineered to retrieve the user information, for example. So what we now suggest is to as we said, we think you should do this throughout the entire research process. And so we structured some more pointers, some more questions along a potential research data lifecycle. So there are different ways in which this could work for research, but we work with this research data lifecycle, which has 6 stages of planning and designing the project, collecting and capturing the data, doing the actual analysis, some large-term managing and preserving the data, maybe releasing and publishing it, and then this released and published data can be used, it can be rediscovered and reused by additional researchers. So that closes the circle here. Yeah, and so we go through these stages and highlight a few more questions that might be worth thinking about at the point in time where this stage is happening. And we've heard in the beginning that there is the principle of not collecting too much data that is not necessary. So in the planning and design phase, it's actually important to reflect on what construct of interest you are about to study, for example, well-being or some other theoretical construct of interest, and whether the data you're about to capture are suitable to actually measure this, and whether maybe a subpart is sufficient for your research question, so that you can kind of do not need to collect all, but can narrow it down. From practical experience in social media research, this is really hard to apply the principles of data protection laws to this stage of social media research, because what is very often happening is that you have an exploratory phase in the beginning. You need to familiarize yourself with what data is actually possible to get from a platform, which collection strategies might work out and might get you the data set that you actually need. While from the legal perspective, you should be aware of what you need, what you want to collect, and kind of tailor that to your specific needs in the very beginning. So you're kind of in a hand-egg situation here, where you would have to make decisions from the start that you only can make after some initial look into the data, and therefore you need probably to collect more data than you will then need for the final project. So we're really in a little conflict situation here. You also should reflect about the potential restrictions by the platforms, carefully consider if you're about to kind of circumvent any restrictions in place and how that plays out. You should think about the sensitivity of the information that you're about to obtain. Yeah, and then there's the question about how to avoid over-collecting, especially in situations where this exploratory phase is needed in order to then narrow it down to the final data set. Special challenges may arise for cases where data from different sources or different platforms are to be combined. And yeah, we cannot go into more detail here during the talk, but this leads to additional questions. So let's look at an example case. A quite common example in social media research is studying elections based on social media data. So there are lots of cases or lots of papers that are doing this, especially based on Twitter data. So lots of existing research looks into Twitter data for election studies, Twitter data around different country elections. At the collection stage, for example, there's a general consideration about can we narrow, do we want to narrow this down to a specific group of users? For example, are we only interested in the in public actors, which would certainly be less problematic than having the general public in there. In most cases, they will be in there. For example, if we also not only collect tweets from the political candidates for an election, but also tweets mentioning these candidates, then we already open it up to the general public. Or when we include hashtags. Especially if we include hashtags which have a very political agenda relation, so this will very likely also include activists of some sort into the data set. And then additional challenges might come up, for example, when we decide that we want to link this data, for example, with any surveys, any polls with the general public about political opinions. At the pre-processing and analysis stage, this actually leads to a whole area of research ethics considerations on their own, where a lot is happening at the moment, and a lot of raising awareness happening. So really something to watch out for the results from these ongoing works at the moment. The general principle is that the data collected often need to be cleaned or pre-processed in some way or the other, and especially what is often happening is that certain users are tried to be linked to demographic information, or that you will want to try to filter out bots or inactive accounts. And in these cases, the use of, for example, natural language processing or other machine learning approaches might indirectly get you into ethical challenges based on how well the method performs and how the resulting data set actually captures the truth to some degree. There are additional challenges, which I also cannot go into detail in the talk, but maybe could talk about later on, if you involve human help at this stage. So, for example, a lot of research is built on using crowd workers from, for example, Amazon Mechanical Turk to label parts of a data set to some degree, and that might lead to additional ethical challenges in how to handle these crowd workers during the research process, as well as research assistants that might be working in your lab, for example. So we stay with our example from the using Twitter data for elections, for election studies. So here a very common approach would be that we would want to use the tweets and the text from the tweets to filter out or to identify topics and also sentiments of the person who has written the tweet. And this is an explicit approach in mining for political opinions and for political topics, which lead to another area where actually data protection thinks this is a very high sensitive topic, political opinions, and needs special protection. So we're entering a very sensitive area here. And in addition to the general challenge of data protection, we have the challenge of mislabeling people, misidentifying their opinions or political labels during this process. We might also want to filter out specific types of accounts, which might also lead to humans being labeled as bots, which has some ethical connotation to it as well, or network structures, and often other aspects like gender detection. And this has been, I'm just pointing to two more references here because this entire area has already led to some discussed cases where the algorithmic approach, for example, to detect gender information about potential social media users based on image data did not perform at all reliably, and especially even was biased in specific cases. For example, when the training data was not representing people of color in the right way, and especially women of color, and their kind of faces wouldn't be recognized or would only be recognized in very few cases correctly. And that is an example that I meant earlier, by where the actual research design and the research approach may contribute to marginalizing communities, to having a real impact on these groups of people. Finally, then you might want to publish results and data, and many people do wish for this to happen more, but it leads to an extra layer of legal and ethical challenges. Especially for re-identification, for adhering to the terms of services of the platform, and you have an extra need to care for data protection in that case. So if we stick to the Twitter example of the election Twitter example, if you would want to preserve and share your data set that you used for a specific Twitter election study, then Twitter actually, by the terms of services, requires you to not share the full data set, not share the full tweet text, as by the terms of services. You may only share the tweet IDs. They can lead others back to the original tweet, but if the tweet has been deleted by the user in the meantime, it will just lead nowhere. And actually this is from a kind of reproducibility point of view, this is of course the worst case. You cannot reproduce the data set based on tweet IDs. But on an ethical level, this is actually close to something like withdrawal of consent, because assuming that if the user who deleted a tweet withdrew the consent of this being publicly seen, publicly accessible, publicly used, this is probably the closest we get to withdrawing of consent in the situation of big data collection of social media data at the moment. And again, for this, there are different situations for politicians versus the general public. So there are platforms which actually explicitly collect deleted tweets from politicians and which are still being in place and doing that also after Twitter has shut them down for a while. They have been reopened because this is considered as a value in itself and considered as a different case. A common discussion point is the statement that, well, why do I have to care about all of this? The data is already public. I'm not doing any harm here. The data is already out there. I can easily use it. There's no problem about that. And that leads to a year-long debate with different incidents along the years in the research community. And I'm just pointing out two very prominent cases in that line that show it's not that easy. It's not something that you can simply assume when the data is somewhere public on a platform, then you can do with it whatever you want. First of all, there are different levels of publicness even within the platforms, as I showed you with the Twitter versus Facebook comparison. And second, even if it is public, you can still ethically do harm to the people beyond the data in other ways than predescended by the actual purpose of the data in the platform. So the two example cases are the taste, ties, and time dataset, which is a dataset that contained Facebook data from students of a specific university that was released anonymized in 2008, and the claim was the data is so well anonymized you will not be able to learn anything about the people involved in the study. But in the end, this wasn't the case. So it was based on the connections between subjects in the data set. In the end, it was possible to identify the university where these students were coming from, and therefore very likely also to narrow it down to specific courses and participants. And the second data set is maybe even clearer case, and that was a data set that was collected, scraped from the dating platform OkCupid, so a platform that was used by people to actually find dates, and that was publicly released and sparked a huge discussion in the research community. So concluding from this, there are lots of challenges. We even didn't get close to covering them all, but we hope that we contributed a useful line of thinking among them based on this research data lifecycle. I think our key point, takeaway message is that ethical considerations may appear in all these stages. The things are getting more complicated because the legal regulations differ across countries, and even though some guidance exists and more is yet to come, we are not yet close to having everything solved here. So our conclusion is you have to include these critical reflections along the lines for your entire research process. And with that, yeah, thank you for your attention.